The wind tore across the plains with a sharpness that felt personal, like it knew her name and meant to drive her down into the dirt. Ruth pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched as dust drifted through the split in the barn wall. It was always dust now on her floor, in her lungs, even on the backs of her eyelids when she closed them to sleep. She barely noticed the smell of rot anymore. Something had died under the far corner weeks ago, but she hadn't the strength or time to dig it out. Her youngest, Eliza, whimpered against her skirts. She was hungry. There were 3 children. Thomas was 10 and trying his best to be a man, which mostly meant bottling things up and failing at it. Hed turned quiet after the burial, and quieter still when the neighbors stopped bringing bread. Maggie ate, stared too long at things she didn't used to notice. She'd started asking questions Ruth couldn't answer. And Eliza, only 4, still cried the way children are supposed to when they believe someone will come. No one was coming. It had been 84 days since David took the horse and went to find work in Trinidad. Hed said a week, 2 at most. He never sent word. No letter. No tracks back across the ridge. No rider cresting the horizon. Just an empty saddle and the silence that followed. She hadn't told the children he might be dead. In her better moments, Ruth thought maybe Hed found something. Some job in the mines or a church group that fed men who'd lost everything but shame. But she didn't really believe it anymore. There was nothing west but more dust and bone. She moved her hands slowly over the washboard, scraping dirt from the same 2 dresses she owned. Not because they were dirty, but because it was something to do. Her skin cracked open on her knuckles from the cold, and still she scrubbed. Cold like this got into you, it bit at your joints, turned breath into smoke. She didn't know how much longer she could keep the stove burning. The woodpile was gone. She had burned the broken chair last week in the crib before that. She had thought about walking to town 12 miles, if she cut straight across the winter fields, but who would watch the children? And what would she find there but closed doors and turned faces? A chicken clucked weakly from the coop. The last one. She had been saving it, though for what she didn't know. Some days she imagined trading it for flour, maybe beans. Other days she saw herself wringing its neck and roasting its low, just to watch the children smile for a minute. She stared at the sky, its color gone, just a pale lake stretching forever. It was December. Nothing grew. Nothing answered. She remembered the time David brought her to this land and said it would all be theirs. The way his eyes had gone wide when the river shimmered under the sun. The way he believed. Now the river was dried to mud and stone, and belief didn't fill stomachs or warm hands. She looked at Thomas through the doorway. He was trying to light the stove with corn husks. His hands shook. They would not survive January like this. She didn't decide all at once. The decision rose slowly, like the tide touching her toes, her knees, until she was drowning in it. She packed what little bread remained in a cloth. She kissed Maggie's hair and told her to watch Eliza. Then she pulled on David's old coat, too big for her frame, and she started walking toward town. She did not look back. She walked until her legs burned and her mouth was dry, until the world blurred around the edges and hers, odds thin to the shape of a single, impossible choice, one she could barely hold in her mind, but there it was, pulsing and awful, because the children needed something she didn't have anymore, and someone, somewhere, had what she didn't. Ruth stepped onto the rutted wagon path as the sun began to fall behind her. The sky turned the color of ashen rust, and her breath came ragged in the cold. She reached the edge of town just before dark. The town was quiet, too quiet for its size. No music from a saloon, no voices spilling from a feed store. Just boots on dirt and the dry slap of shutters in the wind. Ruth pulled the coat tighter, her hands numb. Her feet were soaked through from crossing the last stretch of snow-slick field. She moved toward the church, not because she believed anyone would be there, but because it was the one place snow unlocked. Inside, it was colder than outside. The stove sat empty, its mouth open like a wound. Pews lined up like coffins. She sat in the back and tucked her fingers under her arms to warm them. Her stomach was tight with dread and hunger. Her mind circled one thought. What would she give up for her children? She knew what people said about women like her. Left behind, widowed, maybe, maybe not. Desperate. That word alone made men mean. Desperation drew them in like blood in water. It didn't take long before someone noticed her. A man came out of the shadows behind the altar. She hadn't heard the door. His boots didn't make a sound on the wood. "Cold night," he said. Ruth stiffened. She didn't answer. The man was old, maybe 35, but there was a hollowness behind his eyes that made him feel older. He didn't come closer, just stood by the altar, dust rising around his boots. "You come for shelter?" he asked. She nodded. He tilted his head. "Name's Eli. I help Pastor Warren keep the place from falling in. He's gone to Pueblo for the winter." She was sure if that was supposed to comfort her or warn her. "I got a fire going down by the livery," he said. "There's stew, if you ain't eaten." She stood slowly. "I've got children," she said. "Back home." He looked at her like he already knew. "They'll come with you," she added, voice rough, "if you give me something to take back." Eli blinked, then frowned. "That what you think him after?" She didn't answer. Her legs were trembling. He let out a breath, long and slow. "You want to trade yourself for food?" She looked away, face burning. "I don't want to. I just don't have anything else." For a long time he didn't speak, just watched her like he was weighing something invisible. Then he said, "You look like you ain't slept in a week. More like 2. You'll freeze if you stay here." "They'll freeze if I don't bring food." He didn't argue, just walked past her, opened the door, and motioned for her to follow. She hesitated, then stepped out into the cold again. The livery stable wasn't far. Inside, it smelled of hay and damp wood, but it was warm. A stove in the corner hissed and popped. A pot of stew rested on a grate. Ruth smelled potatoes, onions, something meaty. Her mouth watered painfully. Eli handed her it in plate. "Eat." She stared at him. "Don't make a deal you'll regret just yet," he said. "Eat first, talk after." She took it with shaking hands and sat on a bale of straw. The food burned her tongue, but she didn't stop. Tears spilled down her cheeks and into the stew. She didn't care. Eli didn't watch her while she ate. He busied himself with oiling tack, like he hadn't just stopped a woman from selling herself in a church. When she was done, he handed her a cloth sack. "There's bread and dried meat in there. A tin of beans. Some sugar." She stared at it. He said nothing, just waited. Her throat closed. "Why?" He finally looked up. "Because you didn't have anyone else to ask." And just like that, the hardness in her just cracked. Just a little. Enough for air to get in. If this story held you, subscribe for the ones ahead. She carried the sack home through the deep cold, the sky dimming fast. Her legs dragged like they had stones tied to them, but the smell of stew still clung to her coat, and the memory of warmth kept her upright. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting Eli to change his mind, come riding after her to take the sack back. But the field stayed empty, the road behind her silent. When she reached the cabin, Thomas was standing in the doorway, holding Eliza on his hip like a father would. His face tightened with worry, but he said nothing, just stepped aside. Inside, the air was brittle with cold, but Maggie had bundled blankets around the stove and tried to keep the girls warm with body heat. "I brought something," Ruth said, holding up the sack. Her voice cracked, not from the cold, but from the sight of her children's eyes lighting up, not with joy, exactly, but with something close. She handed the food to Thomas first. Let him portion it out. The boy needed to feel like he could still do something. He opened the sack like it was holy, pulling out bread, meat, sugar. "Where did you get it?" Maggie whispered. Ruth didn't answer. She just sat down on the floor beside them and let Eliza crawl into her lap. That night, they ate more than they had in weeks. Ruth didn't take much for herself. She needed the children strong. She needed them to keep believing she could do something for them. Later, after they'd all curled against one another like animals in a den, Ruth lay awake staring at the roof beams. She felt no pride, but no shame either. Hunger stripped those things away. She didn't expect to see Eli again. But 2 days later he came. She spotted the horse first, a broad-chested gelding with a black coat and a gentle gait. Then she saw him, coat flapping, hat low over his eyes. He rode slow, careful not to spook her. She stepped outside before he could knock. "I didn't expect you," she said. "I brought seed," he said. "Spring's not fall. Thought you might want a head start." She looked down at the sack he held. "Corn, beans, potatoes. Enough to give them a chance if the frost broke early." "I didn't pay you," she said low. Eli studied her face a long moment. "You tried to, but you didn't have to." He handed her the sack. His hands were rough and wind-cracked like hers. "You ever planted potatoes?" "Not in this dirt." "Well," he said, looking over the bare yard and the frost-bitten field behind it, "then I reckon you'll need help." That's how it started. He came every few days, always with something useful, a length of rope, a coil of wire, a chicken that laid. He never stayed long, just long enough to talk the children through something, fix a hinge, show Thomas how to split logs the right way. And Ruth, though she didn't mean to, started to wait for him. She noticed things. How he tied his horse with a double loop. How he scratched behind its ears before he walked away. How he looked tired all the time, but still offered Maggie a smile. Still brought Eliza a peppermint wrapped in paper. Once, while Thomas was trying to build a fence, Eli knelt beside him and said, "I built my first one when I was your age. Crooked as a drunk, but it held." "Did you grow up around here?" Ruth asked him later. He nodded. "Near La Junta. Father died early. Mother didn't have much, but she made sure we never owed anyone." "You believe in that?" "Never owing?" He took his time answering. "I believe in helping when someone's already doing everything they can." Ruth held his gaze. "You think him doing everything?" "I think you're drowning and still keeping your kids dry." The words hit her like a stone in the chest. He stood, brushed off his coat. "Let me know when you're ready to plant." And he left. That night Ruth called in sleep. Not from fear, not from cold, but from something unfamiliar, a warmth that washed from food or fire. Something starting to grow in the places that had long gone barren. Spring came slow that year, like it didn't trust the land. The snow didn't melt so much as vanish, leaving behind soggy earth and 100 kinds of silence. Ruth watched the trees for any sign of green, and when the cottonwoods down by the dry creek showed a shimmer of it, she called to Thomas and Maggie. They planted the potatoes first, fingers red from cold mud, knees soaked. Eli came early and stayed late. He never made himself too large in the space. He worked like it mattered to him, like the rows were his too. He brought scraps of fencing and taught Ruth how to set posts steep so they wouldn't shift. He brought leftover seed from a neighbor and a basket of early onion sets. He brought a book of parables for Maggie and a battered harmonica for Thomas. They never talked about what almost happened that first night. He didn't treat her like someone who'd offered herself, and she didn't bring it up. But it lived between them, unspoken, the shape of her fear and his restraint. One afternoon, while the children were down by the creek, Ruth and Eli worked side by side, shoulders brushing now and then as they set a new gate post. The sun was warm on her back, her hair coming loose in strands around her face. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked, not looking at her. She kept her eyes on the post. "Every day." "What keeps you?" "The children. The memory of what we meant it to be." He nodded. "I left once. Went to Kansas to work a freight line. Didn't last. Something about the land here it pulls." She looked at him then, really looked. His face was worn, sun-lined. His eyes soft, thoughtful. There was pain in him, quiet and old, like a scar that doesn't fade. "You have people?" she asked. He hesitated. "Had a brother. Lost him to scarlet fever. Mother died the year after." "And your father?" Drank himself into the ground. There was no apology in his voice, just the plainness of truth. "I didn't think you were the kind to stay," she said. "I was. Not until I had a reason." They both fell quiet. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of river mud and something faintly green. A hawk cried overhead. Ruth felt a strange, hard thing in her chest begin to soften. Later, while the children ate bread around the stove, Eli lingered by the door. He looked like he wanted to say something but didn't. Ruth followed him outside, arms crossed. He spoke without turning. "You saved your children with nothing but bones and grit. I've never seen anything like it." "I didn't save them," she said quietly. "Not yet." "You will." "Why are you doing this?" she asked, voice steady. "Why keep coming back?" He turned. "Because when I found you in that church, I saw someone who hadn't given up, not even when she should have." She held his gaze. No one had ever said that to her. Not in that way. Not with something like reverence. "I ain't asking for anything," he said, stepping down from the porch. "Just letting you know I see it." He left her standing there in the dim light, the wind curling around her like a whisper. She didn't sleep that night either, but this time it washed from worry. It was the ache of something returning, a feeling she'd buried with David. Not love, not yet, but something like trust. The days stretched longer. Birds returned. Grass fought its way up between stones and frost-scabbed roots. The cabin, which had stood like a tomb all winter, began to feel like a home again. Ruth watched her children change with the season color coming back to their cheeks, the sound of laughter now and then rising from the yard. Eliza chased chickens. Maggie read aloud from Alice's book slowly, like she was feeling out the edges of her own voice. Thomas worked the saw beside his mother, shoulders squared like he wanted the earth to respect him. Eli came most afternoons now. Never asked, never stayed past dusk. He taught Thomas how to shoot without flinching, how to repair a wagon wheel, how to tell if a sky meant hail or rain. He brought Ruth nails oil, a whetstone for the knife that had dulled to nothing through winter. He never tried to take space from her, only offered it. Still, not everything softened with the season. One morning a rider came. Not Eli. A thick man with tobacco-stained fingers and a bristle of beard. He didn't introduce himself. Just swung down from his saddle, kicked the dust from his boots, and said, "This where David Langston lived." Ruth stood in the doorway, broom in hand. She nodded. The man jerked his chin toward the fields. "He owe me money." Thomas stepped up beside her, face tight. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "He left months ago," she said. "I ain't come back." The man grunted. "Figures. Ran off with a whore, far as I heard. Took my horse when he went." Ruth blinked once. "What do you want from me?" Don't die with the man. You got land, animals. Maybe something in the house." She laughed short and sharp. "Look around. You see anything worth stealing?" He glanced over her shoulder, eyes lingering a beat too long. Ruth's spine stiffened. "Best turn back," Thomas said. His voice hadn't broken yet, but the tone in it was solid. The man's eyes narrowed. "That a threat?" "No," came another voice. "It's advice." Eli stepped from behind the shed, rifle swung easy over his shoulder. Not raised, just there, like a fact. The man squinted. "You her man?" "No." "Then stay out of it." Eli stepped forward. "She owes you nothing." The man looked between them, jawed-eyed, but he saw the steadiness in Ella's eyes, saw the rifle. He spat on the ground. "You folks think hard about who you owe. The plains don't forget." He mounted and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and silence. Ruth stood still for a long time, hand frozen on the broom handle. Eli didn't say anything, just waited the way he always did. "David ran?" she asked, voice thin. "Maybe," Eli said. "Or maybe someone wanted you to think you did." She shook her head. "He was perfect, but I didn't think he was. Like that. You don't have to know everything right now." Thomas still stood beside her, fists clenched. Maggie peeked through the door, eyes wide. Ruth took a breath and turned to her son. "Go check on your sisters," she said. He hesitated, then nodded. Only when the children were out of earshot did she sag. "I thought the worst had already come," she said. "I didn't know it was still on its way." Eli moved to her side. "It always comes late, after you've started to hope again. That's how it does the most damage." She looked at him, eyes raw. "I can't do this again, Eli." "You won't have to. Not alone." He didn't touch her, didn't move. But the space between them felt different now, no longer hollow. Ruth stepped inside and shut the door behind her, heart pounding. And for the first time since the fall, she let herself cry. Winter's shadow lingered longer than usual, even as the crops began to push up through the thawing soil. Ruth spent the days teaching the children to tend the rows, to patch fences, and to read the land in the way Eli had taught her. She found herself thinking less about David and more about what she could make survive here, in this dust and wind, with hands raw from work and heart still raw from loss. Eli came as he had, steady and reliable. There was no grand decoration, no sudden gesture, just presence. Sometimes he would lift Thomas onto the back of his horse and ride the fence line with him, explaining why a post needed to be buried deep. Sometimes he would show Maggie how to braid corn stalks to dry for winter feed. And sometimes he would simply sit by the fire while Ruth scrubbed, the silence between them carrying more understanding than words ever could. But the world was never fully kind. One morning a letter came, carried by a writer who refused to speak more than necessary. Ruth held it with trembling hands, recognizing David's handwriting even before breaking the seal. Inside, a brief confession he had taken money he shouldn't have, gambled it away, and fled east, leaving nothing behind. There was no apology that could fix the months of hunger, no explanation that could fill the emptiness he had left. Ruth folded the paper and pressed it to her chest. The children were at her side before she could even speak. Their questions tumbled out. Is he coming back? Will he ever help us again? She shook her head, the truth bitter but clear. He won't, she said softly. We have to make do ourselves. It was in that silence, the kind that carries grief without screaming, that she felt Ella's hand on her shoulder. Steady, solid, a simple gesture, but it anchored her. She didn't move away. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, she allowed herself to depend a little more on Eli, and he on her. They began to share meals, stories of their pasts, the small, unimportant details that built trust and familiarity. She learned that his brother had been the same age as Thomas, that his mother had taught him to plant beans and read the clouds before he could ride a horse properly, and he learned that Ruth had once dreamed of teaching, of seeing her children grow beyond the horizon, rather than fighting every day just to survive. One afternoon, while planting a new row of potatoes, Eli paused and wiped his brow. You ever think about what life could be like if it weren't just surviving, he asked. Ruth kept her eyes on the furrow she was carving. I used to, she said, but dreaming feels dangerous now. Feels like inviting more disappointment. Eli knelt beside her, tracing a line in the earth. Maybe it's the dreaming that keeps us alive. Otherwise, we're just burying ourselves in the dirt, waiting for something to take us. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time didn't flinch. There was no grand confession, no flood of emotion, just recognition. To people who had lost too much, learning that they could still find something worth holding on to. But even as the soil warmed beneath their hands, a shadow loomed. A neighboring rancher, jealous of their small, thriving plot, began pressing hard, questioning Ruth's claim to the land, trying to intimidate her into selling. The children sensed the tension, Thomas growing sullen and Maggie quiet. Ruth felt the old fear clawing back, the fear of losing everything again. She confronted Eli one evening as the sun dipped behind the hills. I can't do this alone, she admitted, voice low. Not with him, not with anyone else. I can't risk losing them again. Ella's hand found hers, this time deliberately. You don't have to, he said. We face it together. That's all that matters. The next days were filled with confrontation and strategy. Eli spoke to the neighboring rancher with calm, unwavering authority, showing deeds, recounting past claims. Ruth spoke at town meetings quietly, unclearly, demanding recognition. Together, they built a defense stronger than fear or words alone. One morning, after weeks of cold tension, the rancher finally left, muttering under his breath, and the land settled back into quiet. Ruth stood on the edge of her field, the sun warm on her face, and felt a lightness she hadn't known in months. The children ran toward her, and she laughed, free and unrestrained. Later, Eli knelt beside the fence, tracing a circle in the dirt with his finger. We survived, he said. You and I. Ruth pressed her hand to his, the ache and relief mingling. We did, she said. The land, once a place of despair, now hummed with life. Soil turned, seeds planted, fences standing. Ruth looked at her children, at the man who had come quietly, without expectation, and realized that survival had turned into something more. Not love at first sight, not fairy tales, but something steady and true: trust, care, and a shared future. The horizon glowed with the promise of summer. The river, once slow and lifeless, sparkled under the sun. Ruth felt the weight lift from her chest, replaced by hope. She turned to Eli, letting herself believe in the quiet possibility of a life rebuilt. His smile was slow, gentle, and honest, and she returned it, knowing that whatever storms might come, they would face them together. The children laughed, the fields were alive, and for the first time since the winter of loss, Ruth allowed herself to imagine a life where her family could flourish. If you felt the weight of the land, subscribe and carry on.